Have you ever stopped to wonder what really happens when someone decides, by choice or circumstance, to stop having sex? The changes are not just physical. They happen at a much deeper level, in the unconscious, and directly affect who you are, how you think, and how you act. The famous Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, known for exploring the most mysterious layers of the human mind, believed that sexual energy, libido, went far beyond the reproductive instinct. For him, this force shaped the entire human psyche. In this video, we'll dive into what Jung called psychic energy transformation, a silent yet powerful process that occurs when the sexual act is stopped. But don't expect simple answers. What lies behind celibacy, abstinence, or even lack of desire can reveal hidden truths about your own soul. If you like deep, psychological reflections that touch on topics often ignored by society, subscribe to the channel now. Here, you will find content that provokes, awakens, and transforms. It's not about what you see, but about how you see the world, and yourself. And most importantly, don't skip this video. Each part is a piece of a puzzle that will only make complete sense in the end. So get ready. What you're about to discover can change the way you understand sex, and especially the absence of it. Now, let's start this journey by exploring the fundamentals of psychic energy according to Carl Jung. For Carl Jung, everything that happens inside us has an energetic origin. But contrary to what many think, this energy is not only biological, it is symbolic, psychic, and, in many cases, spiritual. When someone stops having sex, this energy that was previously channeled into the physical act needs to find new ways to manifest itself. And that's where a quiet but profound transformation begins. Jung called this energy libido, but his concept is much broader than the one used by Freud. For Jung, libido is not just sexual desire, it is a vital force, a drive that moves the human being in all directions, to create, to love, to destroy, to transform. It is as if it were the fuel of the soul. When this force is no longer directed towards sex, it does not disappear. It moves. And depending on how this displacement happens, the effects can be both liberating and devastating. In some cases, the pent-up energy builds up and generates frustration, anxiety, or even physical symptoms. The body begins to manifest what the mind has not been able to process. But when that same energy is consciously redirected to art, to self-knowledge, to spirituality, it transforms. Jung called this sublimation, one of the most powerful tools of the human psyche. Celibacy, for example, practiced by monks and ascetics of various traditions, is a form of energetic containment that does not aim at the denial of pleasure, but at its transmutation. They're not just abstaining, they're redirecting the libido to something bigger, higher. The energy that once sought the other now turns inward, to the archetypes, to the symbols, to the connection with the self, the core of the psychic wholeness. But this process does not always happen harmoniously. When sexual energy is repressed unconsciously, without elaboration, it can manifest itself in disturbing dreams, obsessions, compulsions, or even exaggerated idealizations about love and sex. The energy does not disappear. She masks herself. And this masking, as Jung said, can become a shadow, that part of us that we try to hide, but that always finds a way to express itself. The pause in sex, therefore, is more than an absence of physical contact. It is an energetic reconfiguration. It is an invitation, sometimes forced, sometimes voluntary, to dive into the unconscious. It is at this moment that the deeper contents begin to emerge. Old emotions, forgotten traumas, repressed desires. The absence of immediate pleasure reveals the inner emptiness, but also the possibility of filling it with something new. Jung believed that every crisis carries a chance for individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. And when sex leaves the scene, the libido is free to seek new paths. Perhaps this is the real reason why so many people, when going through periods of abstinence, report finding themselves, discovering new talents, or starting a spiritual journey. This energy has no moral. It is neither good nor bad. It just is. And the more aware we are of its existence and its movements, the more we can use it to our advantage. This is where the great secret of Jungian psychology comes in. transforming instinct into consciousness, drive into direction, chaos into creation. But to understand how this really manifests itself in everyday life, in emotions, choices, and relationships, it is necessary to go deeper. In the next section, we'll explore how abstinence directly affects the unconscious and what it can reveal about who you really are. When sex ceases to occupy its usual space in a person's life, the unconscious notices this change immediately. It is as if one door closed on the outside world and at the same time, another opened inwards. This movement is not only symbolic. It is real, and its effects can be perceived in dreams, involuntary thoughts, and even behaviors that arise without apparent explanation. For Jung, the unconscious is never silent. And when there is a sudden change in energy, as in the absence of sex, he begins to speak louder. This speech, however, does not come in clear words. It manifests itself through images, symbols, strange sensations, patterns that are repeated for no apparent reason. It is the language of dreams, of fantasies, of sudden impulses. And all of this can be intensified by a lack of sexual activity. Not because sex itself is indispensable, but because the energy it carries needs to move. When it is retained, the unconscious reacts, like a river that tries to find new banks to continue flowing. At this point, the person may begin to experience emotions that were not so visible before: neediness, irritability, melancholy, or even a sudden desire for drastic changes. At first glance, it may seem like just emotional instability. But, in fact, it is the unconscious bringing to the surface contents that were dormant. Jung would call this the confrontation with the shadow, the encounter with what we prefer to ignore in ourselves. The absence of sex can disrupt the artificial balance that we often use to avoid facing internal issues. And that's extremely powerful. It is as if the unconscious says, "Now that the noise has stopped, you will have to listen to me." And what emerges from that silence can be uncomfortable, but also revealing. It is the opportunity to understand why we seek pleasure as an escape, why we are afraid of loneliness, why we associate love and desire with unresolved needs. In this process, dreams gain prominence. Jung saw in dreams a direct bridge to the unconscious, and during periods of abstinence, the dream contents usually become more vivid, more symbolic. Many people report erotic dreams, visions of former partners, or even situations of desire that never happened in reality. This is not a mere reflection of the repressed will. It is the way the unconscious tries to reintegrate the aspects of the psyche that have been separated or neglected. These dreams can carry hidden messages, not about sex itself, but about what it represents for each individual: power, connection, self-affirmation, or even fear of surrender. By analyzing these symbolic images, it is possible to discover much more about oneself than during any rational conversation. The unconscious does not lie. It shows in a raw way what needs to be seen. Over time, if the person is open to the process, this abstinence can become a portal to individuation. Jung said that only when we stop projecting our desires onto the other do we begin to recover the lost parts of ourselves. And without sex as a distraction, this rescue becomes possible. But not without pain. It is a process of coping, of inner excavation. Gradually, the individual begins to face essential questions. Who am I besides desire? What is left of me when the other is no longer present to fill the voids? It is at this point that the silence of the body is transformed into listening to the soul. And often, this is the first step towards an awakening that goes beyond sexuality. It touches the purpose, the identity, the meaning of existence. But what happens when this energy, instead of being lost in the unconscious, is used intentionally and creatively? What Jung discovered about sublimation could completely change how you view abstinence and libido itself. Instead of fighting against the absence of sex or repressing it as if it were a problem to be solved, Jung proposes something radically different: to transform this energy into something else. This process, known as sublimation, is one of the most powerful keys to analytical psychology. Rather than allowing the repressed libido to manifest itself in symptoms or compulsions, it is possible to redirect it into creations, discoveries, and expansions of consciousness. And this redirection doesn't happen by accident. It requires intention, attention, and, above all, courage. Sublimation is not a mechanism of negation. On the contrary, it starts from the recognition of sexual energy as a legitimate and essential force of life. But instead of leaving it imprisoned in immediate desire or unconscious fantasies, it is channeled into something that transcends the self. It is when desire is transformed into art, spirituality, knowledge, meaningful action. Jung saw this as one of the noblest expressions of the human psyche, the ability to take something raw, instinctive, and impulsive, and mold it into something elevated, symbolic, loaded with purpose. Great artists, scientists, spiritual leaders, and thinkers in history have often experienced long periods of abstinence, voluntary or otherwise, and many of them have attributed their creative clarity to this state. Not because sex is an obstacle, but because libido, when not consumed by immediate desire, becomes fuel for other achievements. And this phenomenon can be observed by anyone willing to look inside themselves with sincerity. To sublimate is more than to divert the impulse. It is to listen to what it wants to say. The desire for connection, for example, can be transformed into empathy. Neediness in compassion. Passion in creation. The impulse for pleasure can become a search for transcendence. But none of this happens if the person is just repressing or running away. It takes presence, awareness, and willingness to deal with the initial discomfort that the absence of pleasure can cause. At first, unchanneled energy may seem like a burden. The body misses it, the mind tries to rationalize, the unconscious screams. But little by little, with the practice of mindfulness, meditation, creativity, or study, this energy begins to find new ways to circulate. And that's where a real transformation begins. The person begins to feel that he is not only abstaining, but expanding. It is not losing something, but becoming more whole. Jung said that the libido that is not experienced becomes a symptom. That is, when we do not give our energy a conscious destination, it creates unconscious shortcuts. It can turn into irritability, compulsion for food, obsession with work, emotional detachment. All this is the libido trying to manifest itself in unelaborated ways. Therefore, sublimation is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is a way to maintain internal balance and allow vital energy to continue flowing without causing damage. The great beauty of sublimation is in the freedom it offers. When we understand that sexual energy can be directed to any area of life, not just physical pleasure, we gain a new level of autonomy. We are no longer hostages of desire to become authors of our own process of evolution. This does not mean denying the body, but integrating it with the soul. And it's not just a personal choice. We live in a culture saturated with sexual stimuli, where desire is constantly used as a tool for control, consumption, and distraction. Choosing to underline this energy is also an act of resistance, of awareness, of reconnection with what is essential. Instead of following the flow of compulsion, we start walking towards self-knowledge. And with that, something changes profoundly. What was once lack becomes power. What was instinct becomes creation. What was empty is now space for something new to be born. By understanding this process, we begin to realize that sexual energy does not have to be an end in itself. It can be a bridge, a path, a lever for something bigger. And when we use this force with intention, we discover that true pleasure is not only in the body, but in the freedom of being able to transform energy into meaning. But if all this is possible, why are so many people still afraid of abstinence? Why is it still associated with frustration and not with transformation? The answer may lie in the deepest structures of the psyche, in the archetypes that shape our relationship with pleasure, with love, and with the other. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next step: how the collective unconscious and symbolic patterns influence our view of sex, and the silence that comes when it ceases. Much of the way we view sex, and especially the absence of it, comes not only from our personal experiences, but from much older, deeper, and more invisible patterns. Carl Jung called these patterns archetypes, universal images that inhabit the collective unconscious. They shape our perceptions, desires, fears, and fantasies, often without us being aware of it. Since time immemorial, sex has been surrounded by symbols that went far beyond pleasure. For some cultures, it was sacred, a ritual of union between opposing forces. For others, a taboo, something to be repressed and controlled. And between the sacred and the forbidden, myths, stories, and beliefs emerged that to this day influence how we feel and live our sexuality. When we move away from sex, whether by choice or circumstance, these archetypes become even more visible. It is as if, in the silence of absence, the symbols scream. One of the strongest archetypes related to sex is that of the anima and animus, described by Jung as the internal images of the feminine in man and masculine in woman. They are projections that we make on the other, on the partner, and that make us look outside ourselves for something that, in fact, is inside. When we stop having sex, the tendency is for these projections to recede. And what's left? The chance to look at what we really are, without the distorted lens of projected desire. This retraction of projections can be frightening, because they often supported our idea of love, identity, and even self-worth. Without them, we feel vulnerable, exposed. But this is precisely where the real inner work begins. Jung saw in this withdrawal of projected desire an essential step in the process of individuation. Instead of looking for the missing complement in the other, we start looking for the totality in ourselves. Another important archetype in this context is that of the hero, the one who faces trials, resists temptations, and crosses the desert in search of a higher purpose. In periods of abstinence, this archetype can be activated as a metaphor for the inner path. The person feels that he is on a lonely journey, facing inner ghosts, doubts, temptations. But if it stands firm, it crosses an important threshold of consciousness. And it comes back transformed. It is not by chance that many religious and spiritual traditions make use of celibacy as part of the initiatory path. It is not just about denying pleasure, but about activating deep symbols that already exist within us. By temporarily renouncing physical contact, the practitioner activates the archetype of the mystic, the initiate, the seeker. And with that, he comes into contact with aspects of the psyche that are hardly revealed in everyday life. The problem is that our current culture is deeply disconnected from these symbols. Sex is sold as performance, consumption, and entertainment. Abstinence, on the other hand, is seen as failure, repression, or pathology. Rarely is there talk of the possibility of growth, of transmutation, of inner connection. And that's why many feel guilt, shame, or inadequacy when they go through periods without sex. Not because they are really missing something, but because they have internalized a collective archetype that defines them from desire and performance. Jung teaches us that we are not hostages of these symbols. We can dialogue with them, re-signify them, integrate them into our consciousness. But for that, we need to recognize them. We need to understand that there is a much greater force shaping our worldview. That the fear of abstinence isn't just biological, it's symbolic. It is the fear of emptiness, of absence, of silence. But it is also in this silence that the soul speaks. And sometimes, she only speaks when her body is silent. This is the point at which abstinence ceases to be just an interval between experiences and becomes an experience in itself. A crossing. A chance to break patterns, to integrate forgotten parts, to reconnect with something deeper than immediate desire. And that doesn't mean that sex ceases to matter. On the contrary, it starts to have a broader, truer, more integrated meaning. When we understand that the collective unconscious is constantly influencing our choices, including sexual ones, we start to live with more autonomy. We can recognize archetypes, dialogue with them, honor them without blindly submitting. And with that, we free ourselves not from sex, but from the illusions around it. However, there is still an essential element that completes this journey of transformation, the return of the sacred. A deep reconnection between body, soul, and spirit. And this is precisely what we will explore in the next step. How sexuality, when understood in its symbolic essence, can become a path of elevation and not just pleasure. Throughout this journey of silence and transformation, an often forgotten dimension begins to emerge, the dimension of the sacred. In a world where sex is almost always treated as something physical, instinctive, or utilitarian, the idea that it can carry a spiritual meaning seems, at first glance, something old-fashioned, or even out of place. But it is precisely this disconnection that prevents us from perceiving the power that exists in sexuality as a bridge between the body and the soul. For Carl Jung, true balance is only achieved when the human being integrates all its parts: instinct, emotional, rational, and spiritual. And sexual energy, when it is not consumed unconsciously, can become a direct path to this integration. Not because sex should be moralized or repressed, but because it contains, in its essence, a symbolic power much deeper than the simple satisfaction of a desire. Ancient cultures knew this. In Eastern traditions such as Tantra, sex is a path of expansion of consciousness. It is not just a question of techniques, but of an inner attitude, presence, surrender, listening, reverence. Sexual energy, when cultivated with attention and respect, becomes a creative force that uplifts rather than just consumes. And even in abstinence, this energy lives on. It doesn't die, it just changes direction. When sexuality is rescued as sacred, even its absence acquires a new value. Abstinence is no longer a hole to be filled and becomes a fertile space, where the individual can dive to find what is most intimate in him. It is in this void that the spirit can be heard. It is there that the silence of the body becomes an invitation to total presence. Jung believed that the true process of individuation passed through this rescue of the sacred. And this does not mean religiosity, but reconnection with what is essential, with that which is beyond the ego, beyond the need for validation, beyond the search for immediate pleasure. The sacred, in this sense, is not outside, it is inside. It is in the ability to live with meaning, with depth, with awareness, even, and perhaps especially, in moments of absence. By re-signifying sex within this symbolic context, we realize that the body is not only a means for pleasure, but a temple of expression of the spirit, and that the energy that dwells in it can be used in different ways: to create, to heal, to transform, to love more fully and truly. Sexuality, when elevated, ceases to be just an instinct and becomes language, a form of communication with the invisible. Of course, this path is not simple. It requires deconstructing beliefs, confronting patterns, welcoming shadows. It is necessary to look at the way we use sex to fill voids, anesthetize pain, or maintain illusions. And, at the same time, it takes courage to seek a new way of living this energy, more conscious, more symbolic, more connected with who we really are. The good news is that this process does not require ready-made formulas. Each person finds their own path. Some will rediscover pleasure with more presence. Others will choose periods of silence as a form of self-knowledge. And still others will transform sexual energy into art, spirituality, or service to the world. There is no ideal model. What exists is the possibility of living with more truth. And this is where the entire journey taken so far begins to make sense. Abstinence is no longer just absence. Sublimation, more than a strategy, becomes a practice of consciousness. The archetypes that once controlled us now become allies on the path to integration. And the sacred, finally, is rediscovered as part of us, not as something distant or idealized, but as a direct, living, present experience. When we understand sex as something that transcends the body, as an energy that can be felt even in silence, as a symbol of life that pulsates independently of the physical act, we take a step towards psychic maturity. We stop being dominated by the impulse and start dancing with it. In harmony. In respect. Expanding. This is the point at which the journey approaches its end, but not a closed end, but an opening. A new way of looking at one's own desire, one's own relationships, one's own body. An invitation to live with more awareness, more depth, and more meaning. And that's exactly what we'll talk about in the conclusion. What do we really learn when sex goes silent? What new possibilities are opening up? How do we emerge transformed from this process? And what does it reveal about who we truly are? We have reached the end of a journey that, although it began with a simple question, "What happens when you stop having sex?" revealed layers much deeper than superficial answers could offer. Along this path, we understand that the absence of sex is not just a void to be lamented or a taboo to be overcome. It is a rare opportunity to reconnect with oneself, a symbolic crossing that can reveal hidden aspects of our psyche, reorient our desire, and broaden our perception of what it really means to live. Carl Jung showed us that sexual energy, libido, is not confined to the sexual act. It is the vital force that drives the human being to creation, to the search for meaning, to love, to growth. When this energy is no longer channeled solely into the body and pleasure, it becomes available for other expressions: art, spirituality, purpose, inner transformation. That is the essence of sublimation, not as escape, but as elevation. We have also seen that behind many of our impulses, expectations, and fears about sex, there are deep archetypes that operate silently in the collective unconscious. The absence of sex, therefore, does not only reveal a not doing, it exposes the symbols that shape our identity, our beliefs, and our bonds with the other. It is in this symbolic silence that the chance to review patterns and reconstruct the very meaning of intimacy, surrender, and pleasure emerges. And it was in this same silence that we rediscovered the sacred, not as something mystical or religious, but as a dimension of life that only reveals itself when we get closer to what is essential. By ceasing to see sex as a mere instinct or performance and recognizing it as an expression of something greater, we touch a deeper truth about what it means to be human. We are body, yes, but also soul. We are desire, but also consciousness. We are impulse, but also intention. Stopping having sex, in this context, is neither a setback nor a punishment. It can be a movement of healing, of reconnection, of awakening. It is not a matter of denying desire, but of listening to it more attentively. To ask what he is trying to show us. To realize that behind the need of the other, there is an even greater need to become whole. Perhaps, at the end of this journey, the truest answer is that when sex is silent, the soul begins to speak. And what she has to say isn't always easy to hear, but it's always profoundly liberating. Because it invites us to step off the surface and dive into what really matters: meaning, true bonding, real transformation. If you've made it this far, you may already be feeling that this conversation was more than information. It was a calling, an invitation to look at your energy, your intimacy, and your silence with new eyes. And if that content resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we explore deep themes with seriousness, sensitivity, and awareness. And this journey of self-knowledge, freedom, and reconnection with the soul is just beginning.